You want to know the exact moment the galaxy understood it had made a mistake. It wasn't the day the human ships arrived. Everybody thinks it was. They tell it that way in the schools now, all across the settled systems. They say the coalition looked up one morning and saw a human fleet hanging over their border worlds, and that was the moment they knew. It wasn't the human fleet they could handle, or they thought they could. A few hundred ships, fast and mean and better crewed than anyone expected, but still a fleet. Ships can be counted. Ships can be fought. You can look at a fleet and do the math, and even if the math scares you, at least it's math. At least it's a number you can hold in your head. No. The moment the galaxy understood, really understood, all the way down to the bottom of its collective stomach, was 3 weeks later, when the thing behind the fleet finally arrived. I was there for it. I saw the whole thing with my own 2 eyes, from a listening post on a rock called Colossal 9, where I had absolutely no business being, and where I have replayed those events every single night for the 40 years since. My name doesn't matter much, but for the record, so you know, this is a real account from a real set of eyes and not some story somebody made up after the fact. My name is Oren Vale. I was a signals technician, 3rd class, 19 years old, and I was the only human within 4 light years when it happened. I want to tell you what I saw, all of it. The way it actually happened, not the way the recordings show it, because the recordings don't have the smell of that station, or the way my hands shook, or the sound an old xenolinguist makes when she starts to cry from pure terror in a language you don't understand. So settle in, this is going to take a while. It's worth it. Let me set the scene, because you need to understand where I was and why, or none of the rest of it lands right. Colossal 9 was a nothing rock, a moon technically, orbiting a gas giant so far out from its dim little star that the whole system barely counted as inhabited. There was one settlement on the moon, a mining and relay outpost run by the coalition, maybe 300 souls, most of them Farron. You've seen Farron. Tall, gray-skinned, 6 long fingers on each hand, faces that never quite show you what they're thinking. Good people mostly, patient people. They'd been running that relay station for 200 years before I ever set foot on it. The station sat on a ridge above the mining pits, a cluster of pressurized domes and towers, and above it all rose the relay array. A forest of antennas and dishes reaching up into a sky that was never really dark, because the gas giant filled half of it, banded orange and brown and always turning, slow and enormous and silent. I loved that sky, actually. I want to say that because a lot of what comes next is ugly, and I don't want you to think the whole place was ugly. It wasn't. On a clear cycle, with the gas giant full and the rings catching the distant sunlight, that sky was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I used to climb up to the observation tower on my off shifts and just look at it. The Farron thought I was strange for that. They'd lived under it their whole lives and stopped seeing it. But I never stopped seeing it. 19 years old, 180 light years from the world I was born on, and I'd sit up there in the tower and watch that giant planet turn and feel like the luckiest person alive. Now, why was I there? A human on a coalition relay station in the middle of nowhere. That's a longer story than we have time for, but the short version is this. It was peacetime, or what passed for peacetime. Humanity had only been out among the stars for about 60 years by then, and we were new and small, and nobody took us very seriously. We'd signed a handful of treaties, opened a handful of embassies, and as part of one of those agreements there was an exchange program. Coalition technicians came to human stations. Human technicians went to coalition stations. The idea was that we'd learn to trust each other by working side by side. I'd volunteered. God knows why. I think I just wanted to see something. I was a kid from a factory colony where the biggest thing that ever happened was a shift change, and here was a chance to go live under an alien sky and learn how an alien relay array worked. I signed the papers so fast the recruiter laughed at me. So there I was, the only human on Tessel 9, the only human, as it turned out, for 4 light years in any direction. The Farron were kind to me in their patient, unreadable way. There was a station chief named Vorsi Tell, old even by Farron standards, who took a sort of grandmotherly interest in me. She thought I ate wrong and slept wrong and worked too hard, and she was right on all 3 counts. She used to bring me these little dried fruits from the station's greenhouse and stand over me until I ate them. I can still taste them if I concentrate. Sweet and a little bitter, like a date that had second thoughts. And there was the xenolinguist. Her name was Antje Rue. She wasn't Farron, she was something else, a species I'd never seen before I met her, small and quick with skin that shifted color slightly depending on her mood, though I never got good enough at reading it to know what the colors meant. She was the station's translation specialist, responsible for monitoring and interpreting the signal traffic that flowed through the relay. She was brilliant. She spoke, by her own count, over 300 languages. She could listen to a scrap of transmission and tell you not just what species sent it, but roughly what region of what species territory they came from, the way you or I might place an accent. Antje and I became friends. Real friends, the way you do when you're both a little bit strange and a little bit far from home. She was fascinated by human languages. She said we spoke like we were always slightly out of breath, which I still think about, and I was fascinated by her, by the sheer impossible depth of what she knew. We'd sit in the monitoring station on the long, quiet shifts and she'd teach me things. How to hear the shape of a language you didn't understand. How to tell a threat from a greeting by rhythm alone. How every species that ever learned to talk did it a little differently, and how those differences told you everything about who they were. I'm telling you about Antje because she matters. She matters more than almost anyone in this story. Because when it happened, when the thing came, Antje Rue was the first person in that whole system to understand what she was hearing. And it broke her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me slow down. The first sign that anything was wrong came about 6 weeks before the fleet. It was small, so small that nobody but Antje even noticed, and even she almost let it go. We were on a night shift, station night, the arbitrary dark cycle they kept to give everyone a rhythm, and the relay was doing its usual quiet work, passing traffic between the inner coalition worlds and the frontier. Routine stuff, cargo manifests, diplomatic pouches, somebody's mail. The relay didn't read any of it, of course, it just passed it along encrypted the way relays do. But Antje monitored the metadata, the shapes of the traffic, the volume and rhythm of who was talking to whom. And that night she went very still. I noticed because we'd been in the middle of a conversation. I don't even remember what about, something stupid. I think I was complaining about the food and she just stopped. Mid-sentence. Her skin went a color I hadn't seen before, a kind of pale, flat gray, and she leaned in toward her console and stared at it like it had said something to her. What? I asked. What is it? She didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said quietly, the frontier just went quiet. Quiet how? 3 stations, out past the Kale Drift. She pointed at the display at 3 little markers that meant nothing to me. They've stopped relaying, all 3, within about an hour of each other. I shrugged. I was 19. Maybe there's a storm out there, solar weather. Knocks out the arrays sometimes, right? Sometimes, she said, but she didn't look like she believed it. Not usually all 3 at once, not usually this clean. She was quiet again, working her console, pulling up traffic logs, her long fingers moving fast. There's no distressed traffic, that's the strange part. When a station goes down from weather, there's always a lead-up, degrading signal, automated warnings, somebody complaining. These just stopped. Mid-transmission, all 3, like someone turned them off. Or like something turned them off, I said. I don't know why I said it, it just came out. Antje looked at me, and her skin did that thing again, that pale flat gray, and I realized, I understand it now, though I didn't then, that the color was fear. Yes, she said. Or that. We reported it, of course. Antje flagged it up the chain to Chief Vorsi, and Vorsi passed it along to the Coalition Regional Authority, and about 2 days later we got a response that basically said, "Noted, probably solar weather, don't worry about it, resume normal operations." So we resumed normal operations. But Antje started listening differently after that. I could tell. She'd always been attentive, but now there was an edge to it. She started coming in early for her shifts, staying late. I'd find her at the monitoring station at hours when she should have been asleep, headphones on, skin that pale flat gray, listening to the empty places where 3 stations used to be. "You're going to make yourself sick," I told her once. "Something's coming," she said. She didn't look up. I can hear the shape of it. There's a pressure in the traffic. Do you understand? It's like the water pulling back from the shore before a wave. Everything's flowing the wrong direction, away from something, and I can't see what. I didn't understand. Not then. But I remember the words exactly, because in about 6 weeks I'd understand them completely, and by then it would be far too late for any of us to get to higher ground. I want to slow down here and tell you what those weeks were actually like, day to day, because the histories skip right over them, and they were, in their own quiet way, some of the strangest days of my life. Nothing dramatic happened, you understand. That's the thing about living inside the beginning of a catastrophe. While it's happening, it doesn't look like a catastrophe. It looks like an ordinary week with a wrongness underneath it. We ran our shifts. We ate our meals. The mining crews went down into the pits and came back up. The greenhouse grew its fruit. Chief Vorsi did her rounds. On the surface, Tessel 9 went on being exactly what it had always been, a sleepy relay station on a nothing rock at the edge of everything. But underneath, something had changed. You could feel it. It was in the way people talked a little more quietly. The way Antje stopped humming at her console the way she used to. The way the news from the frontier, when it came, made everyone go still for a second before pretending they hadn't heard it. Another station dark. Then another. Each one a little name on a display, a little marker winking out, and each one landing in the pit of your stomach a little heavier than the last. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie in my bunk and stare at the ceiling and think about those dark stations. I kept imagining the people on them. Every one of those markers had been a station full of people, just like ours, technicians and miners and cooks and kids, living their ordinary lives on their own nothing rocks, until whatever it was came out of the dark and silenced them. I didn't know yet that it was human. I just knew something was eating the frontier, station by station, coming closer, and that we were on its path, and that there was nowhere to run to, because the whole point of Tessel 9 was that it was in the middle of nowhere. I remember one night I couldn't stand it anymore, and I got up and went to find Antje. It was the middle of station night, everyone asleep, and I found her exactly where I knew she'd be, at her console, headphones on, listening. She'd taken to sleeping there, more or less, napping in the chair between transmissions. She looked terrible, but she looked up when I came in, and she managed a tired smile, and she pulled off the headphones. "Can't sleep," she said. "No," I admitted. I sat down in the chair next to hers. "You." "I don't really sleep anymore," she said. "Not properly. I keep thinking if I stop listening, even for a few hours, I'll miss the thing that tells us what it is. And I have to know what it is, Oren. I can't explain it. I have to be the one who knows first. If I know first, maybe I can, I don't know, warn someone, do something. Matter." She rubbed her eyes. "It's stupid. There's nothing I can do, but I can't stop listening anyway." We sat there together in the dim light of the monitoring station, 2 young people a long way from home, listening to the empty dark where the stations used to be. And after a while, I asked her the question that had been keeping me up. "Antje, do you think we're going to die?" She was quiet for a long time. I appreciated that. She didn't rush to reassure me, didn't feed me some easy lie about how everything would be fine. She took the question seriously, the way she took everything seriously. "I don't know," she said finally. "I think whatever's coming, it's methodical. Do you hear what I mean? It's not random, it's not a storm or a plague or a wild thing. It goes station to station in order along a line like it has a purpose and a destination. And things with a purpose are more frightening than things without one because you can't hope they'll just wander off. But she turned to look at me. Things with a purpose can also be reasoned with sometimes, if you can understand the purpose. A storm can't be talked to, but whatever this is, it wants something. And if I can figure out what it wants, maybe there's a way through. That's why I listen. Not just to know what it is, to know what it wants. Because knowing what something wants is the only real protection there is against it. I've thought about that so many times. Knowing what something wants is the only real protection there is against it. She was right, of course. In the end, that's exactly what saved us. Antje figured out what the thing wanted. She translated the transmission. She understood it was humanity. She understood the debt of Herrol's reach. And that understanding was worth more than any weapon. Because we knew when the fortress came what it wanted. We knew it wanted the 19 and justice and to be remembered. We knew it didn't want us. And that knowledge is the only reason 300 Farron and one human boy didn't spend the arrival of the fortress in blind animal terror. We were frightened, yes, but we weren't in the dark. Antje had made sure of that. She'd listened until she understood, and understanding was the light we all navigated by when the biggest darkness any of us had ever seen rose up over the gas giant. "You should try to sleep," she told me that night. "One of us should. I'll wake you if anything happens." I didn't sleep, but I stayed there with her in the chair, and eventually the station dawn came, thin and gray, and we watched it together, and it was a little easier to face the day having faced the night beside a friend. That's a small thing. But small things are what get you through the beginning of a catastrophe. The big things, the fortress, the fleet, the history, those come later. In the beginning, it's just two scared people in a dim room, keeping each other company in the dark, and somehow that turns out to be enough to keep going. The 3 quiet stations turned into 5, then 8, then a dozen. By the 4th week, the coalition couldn't pretend it was solar weather anymore. Something was moving through the frontier, out past the Kale Drift, and it was silencing relay stations one after another as it came. And nobody knew what it was because every station that might have gotten a good look at it went dark before it could report anything useful. There were theories. There are always theories. Pirates, some said, a big organized raider fleet, hitting the frontier for salvage and ransom. Others thought it was one of the old rival powers, the Sethiri Combine or the Drown Hegemony, making some kind of aggressive move under cover of the frontier's emptiness. A few of the Farron thought it was something worse, something older, one of the dead space horrors their oldest stories warned about, though they wouldn't say much about those and got uncomfortable when I asked. Nobody guessed humans. Why would they? We were new. We were small. We had a few hundred ships total and a reputation at that point for being scrappy but harmless. The kind of species you invited to sign treaties precisely because it wasn't a threat. The idea that the thing eating the frontier might be human never crossed a single coalition mind. Antje figured it out first. I want to tell this part carefully, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on, and because it's the last time I ever saw Antje rue as herself, bright and quick and fascinated by the universe, before what she learned changed her. It was the 5th week, late in a night shift. I brought her a cup of the terrible station tea because she hadn't slept properly in days and I was worried about her, and I set it down next to her console and she didn't even notice it. She had her headphones on. She was listening to something. And her hands had stopped moving. That's what caught my attention. Antje's hands were never still. Even when she was thinking, they moved, tapping, gesturing, tracing shapes in the air as she worked through a problem. But now they were frozen, both of them flat on the console, and her skin was a color I had genuinely never seen on her. Not the pale, flat gray of fear. Something past that. A kind of white, almost translucent, like all the color had drained straight out of her. "Antje," I said. She didn't move. "Antje." I put my hand on her shoulder. She flinched like I'd burned her and pulled off the headphones and turned to look at me, and I swear to you I will never forget her face as long as I live. I caught a fragment, she said. Her voice was very small. From the last station, before it went dark, just a few seconds, a distress relay. It got a transmission off before the end, a recording of a signal it intercepted, and it pushed the recording through before whatever was happening reached it. She swallowed. I've been trying to translate it. And I did, she laughed, a strange, broken little sound with no humor in it at all. I did translate it. That's the problem, Oren, I translated it. What did it say? She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I didn't understand at all at the time. She said, "It's your people." I blinked. What? The signal, the species doing this, the one eating the frontier. Her white translucent skin, her small shaking voice. It's human. The transmission was in a human language. English, one of your main ones. I almost didn't recognize it. I've only studied your languages a little, you're so new, but I know enough. I know enough to be sure. She pressed her hands flat against the console again like she needed it to hold her up. The thing that's coming, the thing that's been silencing the stations, it's yours. I remember I laughed. I actually laughed out of pure disbelief. That's not possible, I said. Antje, we don't have anything out here. We're not at war with anybody. We've got a few hundred ships and half of them are for show. There's no way a human fleet is out past the Kale Drift eating relay stations. Somebody's using a stolen human transmitter or a translation glitched, or... Oren, she said my name quietly and it stopped me cold. I have translated 311 languages. I do not glitch. I know what I heard. Then what did it say? I asked. The transmission, if it was human, what did it actually say? She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me. And I want you to understand, I want you to really understand that when she told me I did not feel proud. People ask me that sometimes when I tell this story. They ask if I felt proud hearing what my species had said, knowing what was coming, and the answer is no. I felt sick. I felt cold all the way through, because the words weren't the words of the humanity I knew. They were something else. Something the galaxy had never seen from us, because we'd never had a reason to show it, because nobody had ever done the thing that would make us show it. The transmission, Antje said, was short, just a few lines. A standard human military hail, the kind one ship sends another, and it said this. Coalition Frontier Station. This is the human Vanguard. We know what you did at Herrol's Reach. We know about the colony. We have the recordings and we have counted the dead and we are coming. The fleet is the first thing you will see. It is not the last. Stand down or don't. It changes nothing now. And then Antje said there was one more line. Sent after a pause, not part of the standard hail, something the human commander had added personally off script. You should not have touched the children. I need to tell you about Herrol's Reach, because until that night I didn't know. None of us on Tessel 9 knew. We were too far out, too isolated on the wrong side of a frontier that had gone dark. The news hadn't reached us. It had reached the human fleet clearly, but not us. Herrol's Reach was a human colony, a new one of the farthest flung settlements humanity had established, out near the edge of coalition space, in a system that both sides technically claimed but neither had bothered to formally settle. It was small, agricultural mostly, a few thousand people who'd gone out to the very edge of everything to build farms under a new sun, families, a lot of families. That's what you get on an agricultural colony. Families, kids, people who want land and quiet and a fresh start. I learned the details later over years, piecing them together from records and testimony, and the accounts of the few who survived. I'll give them to you the way I eventually understood them, though it took me a long time, and some of it I still can't say out loud without stopping. The coalition, not the whole coalition, but a faction within it, a hardline military bloc that had been agitating for years about human expansion, decided that Herrol's reach was a line in the sand. A test. They wanted to see what would happen if they pushed. Whether humanity would fight for a colony that far out, or fold, the way small new powers usually fold when a big established one leans on them. So they sent a battle group to Herrol's reach, and they didn't just occupy it or blockade it or demand its surrender. They made an example of it. I'm not going to describe what they did. I know the details, I've read the reports, I've seen the recordings that the human fleet carried with them, the same recordings that Ancha's dying relay station passed along in fragments. I know exactly what happened at Herrol's reach, and I'm not going to put it in this account, because some things you shouldn't have to hear, and because the people who did it counted on the horror of it doing their work for them. They wanted humanity afraid. They wanted the galaxy to see what happened to species that reached above their station. What they got instead was the Vanguard. Because here's the thing about the humanity of that era, the thing the coalition military bloc did not understand, could not have understood, because they'd never seen it. We were new. We were small. We'd spent our whole short time among the stars being agreeable, being careful, signing treaties and opening embassies, and sending 19-year-old signals technicians to live on alien relay stations as gestures of good faith. The galaxy had decided that meant we were harmless. That the agreeableness was the whole of us. That underneath the treaties there was nothing but a small, soft, accommodating little species that could be pushed. They mistook our patience for weakness. They mistook our kindness for the absence of anything else. And then they touched the children at Herrol's reach. And humanity showed them the rest of what we were. The fleet arrived at Colossal 19 days after Ancha translated that transmission. I remember the number because I counted. Every one of those 19 days I counted. Once we knew what was coming, once Ancha had translated it and Chief Vorsey had confirmed it up the chain, and the whole station understood that the thing eating the frontier was human and it was headed our way, the waiting started. And the waiting was its own kind of horror. You have to understand the position we were in. The Farron of Colossal 9 had done nothing. They weren't part of the military bloc that attacked Herrol's reach. They were a mining and relay outpost 300 people strong, on the wrong side of a frontier, who'd never hurt a human in their lives. Chief Vorsey had, in fact, been openly critical of the hardliners for years. I learned that during those 19 days, as she made call after call trying to get someone, anyone, in the coalition to understand what was coming and to make it stop. Nobody would listen, or rather they listened but they didn't believe. The coalition regional authority kept insisting that the human threat was overblown. A few hundred ships, they said. A small, new species throwing a tantrum over a border colony. It would be dealt with. There was no need for panic on a remote relay station. Resume normal operations. Resume normal operations. They kept saying that, right up until the end. I think those words are carved on the tombstone of the entire coalition military bloc, honestly. Resume normal operations. They said it while the frontier went dark station by station. They said it while a human fleet crossed their space unopposed. They said it right up until the moment the fleet arrived at Colossal 9. And even then, some part of the coalition command structure was still insisting that it was all being handled. And here's the part that I've never fully made peace with, the part that I think about most. I could have left. I was a human, on a station full of Farron in the path of a human fleet. When it became clear what was coming, Chief Vorsey came to me privately. She pulled me into her office, this old gray-skinned woman with her unreadable face, and she told me that if I wanted, she would arrange transport. Get me out. Send me deeper into coalition space, away from the path of the fleet, somewhere safe. Because whatever the humans were coming to do, they wouldn't do it to me. I was one of them. And I said no. I've asked myself 1,000 times why. 19 years old, a chance to get clear of the worst thing I would ever witness, and I said no. Part of it was Ancha. I couldn't leave her. By then she was barely sleeping, barely eating, coming apart at the seams from the weight of what she'd heard, and I couldn't imagine getting on a ship and leaving her to face it alone. Part of it was Vorsi herself and the little dried fruits and the 300 Farron who'd been nothing but kind to me. And part of it, I'll be honest, because this whole account is worthless if I'm not honest, part of it was that I needed to see. I needed to understand what my own species was, what it was capable of, what it became when you did the thing you must never do. I couldn't run from that. I had to look at it. So I stayed. And 19 days after Ansha translated the transmission, the human fleet dropped out of the dark above Tessel 9, and I got my look. I was in the observation tower when they came. The one I loved, the one with the view of the gas giant. I'd gone up there because if the fleet was going to arrive, I wanted to see it with my own eyes, not on a screen. It was station night. The gas giant hung huge and orange in the sky, 3/4 full, its bands turning slow. The rings caught the distant starlight. It was, as always, beautiful. And then the stars behind it started going out. That's how you see a fleet arrive from a distance, if you don't have the instruments to track it properly. You see the stars go out, one by one, then in clusters, then in whole swaths, as the ships slide into position and their hulls blot out the light behind them. I stood in that tower and I watched a piece of the sky simply vanish, a growing patch of absolute black where stars used to be. And I understood that each one of those vanished stars was a human warship, and that there were hundreds of them, and that they were here. Then their running lights came on. All at once. Hundreds of them, thousands of individual lights blooming out of the darkness in perfect coordinated silence, red and white and cold blue, arranged in formations so precise it made my chest hurt. The human fleet lighting itself up over an alien world, announcing itself, saying, "Here we are. Look at us. Look at what you woke." I heard the tower door open behind me. It was Ansha. She'd come to find me, come to watch it with me, and she stood beside me at the window and we looked at the lights together, the human's friend and the human, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then Ansha said very quietly, "It's beautiful." And it was, God help me, it was. That was the terrible thing. The fleet was beautiful, hanging there in the dark, all those cold, precise lights. Beautiful the way a blade is beautiful. Beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with kindness. "That's the Vanguard," Ansha said. "The transmission said the fleet was the first thing we'd see. The Vanguard." She turned to look at me, her skin that pale, translucent white. "Oren, if that's the Vanguard, if all of that is just the first thing, then what's coming behind it?" I didn't have an answer. Neither of us did. But we were about to find out. And before we did, there was the fleet itself to survive. Because a fleet that has crossed a frontier to answer for murdered children does not simply hang in the dark being beautiful. A fleet like that has business, and Tessel 9 was directly in its path. Let me tell you what the first night was like. The hail came about an hour after the lights. I was still in the observation tower. I hadn't moved, couldn't move. I was rooted to that window watching the fleet, when the station's general comm crackled to life. Chief Vorsi's voice, calm and careful, telling all personnel to report to their stations and remain calm, that the human fleet had opened communications, and that she was going to speak with them. I ran down out of that tower and through the corridors to the monitoring station, because that was my post and Ansha's post, and if anyone was going to hear what the humans said, it would be us. Ansha was right behind me. We crashed into the monitoring station together, both of us breathing hard, and we got the headphones on just in time to hear the human voice come through. I'll never forget that voice. It was a woman's voice, older, steady. There was no anger in it. That was the thing that frightened me most, honestly, the complete absence of anger. When you're expecting rage and you get calm instead, calm is so much worse, because rage burns out. Rage makes mistakes. Calm doesn't. "Coalition Relay Station Tessel 9, the voice said. "This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Keene commanding the human Vanguard. I am addressing your station chief. Identify yourself." Vorsi answered. Her voice was steady too, though I knew her well enough by then to hear the strain underneath. "This is Station Chief Vorsi Tell, Admiral. I command this outpost. We are a civilian mining and relay facility. We have 311 souls aboard, all non-combatant. We are unarmed. We have no part in the events at Herrol's Reach, and we condemn them without reservation." There was a pause, a long one. I remember Ancha's hand finding mine and gripping it hard. "I know," Admiral Keene said finally. "I know what you are, Chief Tell. We have your records. We have your station's traffic logs. We know you're civilian, we know you're unarmed, and we know you had no part in Herrol's Reach." Another pause. "I also know that your Chief Tell has spent the last 5 weeks trying to raise the alarm about us up her own chain of command, and that she was ignored. We intercepted those transmissions, all of them." Vorsi didn't say anything. I think she was surprised. "You tried to stop this," Keene said. "For what it's worth, and I know it isn't worth much from where you're sitting, I want you to know that we noticed. It matters to us who tried." And that was the moment I understood something about the fleet that changed how I saw everything that came after. They weren't a mob. They weren't a berserk swarm of vengeance burning down everything in their path. They were paying attention. In the middle of the largest military operation in human history, crossing a hostile frontier to answer for a massacre, they had taken the time to notice that one old Farron station chief on a nothing rock had tried to do the right thing. And they decided it mattered. That's discipline. That's the kind of discipline that should have terrified the coalition far more than the guns did. Because a force that can stay that clear-eyed, that precise, that fair even while it's grieving and furious, that's a force that isn't going to burn out, isn't going to make the mistakes you're counting on, isn't going to stop until it has finished exactly what it came to do and not one thing more. "Admiral," Vorsi said carefully, "may I ask what you intend for this station?" "Nothing," Keene said. "You have my word. No harm will come to Tessel 9 or anyone aboard it. You're not who we came for." A pause. "But I'm going to ask something of you, Chief Tell, and I'm going to be honest that it isn't really a request." "Ask." "Your relay is the last functioning coalition node before the inner systems. Every other station between here and the frontier is dark. You know that, you've watched it happen, which means yours is the station the coalition will be listening to. When the rest of it arrives, and there it was again, the rest of it, that phrase, and I felt Ancha's hand tighten on mine, I want your relay to carry it, all of it, every transmission we send. I want the inner coalition to see exactly what's coming, through your array, in full, with nothing filtered and nothing softened. Can you do that?" Vorsi was quiet for a moment. "You want to use my station to broadcast a warning." "I want to use your station to broadcast the truth," Keene said. "There's a difference. A warning is something you give to fright. The truth is just the truth. I want the coalition to see us coming. I want them to have every chance to understand what they did and what it cost them and what they're about to face. I don't want anyone ever to be able to say they didn't know." A pause. "The people at Herrol's Reach didn't get a warning, Chief Tell, but I'm not them. So the coalition gets one. Through you." And Vorsi, I watched her, on the monitor in her office, this old gray-skinned woman who'd spent 5 weeks screaming into a void that wouldn't listen. Vorsi closed her eyes for a moment. And then she opened them and she said, "Yes, Admiral, my station will carry it, all of it, nothing filtered." "Thank you," Keene said, and then after a beat, "Chief Tell, there's a human on your station, a technician exchange program, Oren Vale." My blood went cold. I heard my own name in that steady, terrible voice, and my whole body went rigid. "There is," Vorsi said. "Is he all right?" Vorsi glanced at the monitor. She knew I was listening. She knew Ancha and I were in the monitoring station, and something almost like warmth crossed her unreadable face. "He is all right, Admiral. He is well. He has been treated as one of our own since the day he arrived, and when I offered to evacuate him to safety, he refused to leave us." There was a silence on the line. "Did he?" Keene said. And I couldn't read her voice at all in that moment. Put him on. Vorsi looked at me through the monitor, nodded. My hand was shaking as I reached for the comm. This is Oren Vale, I said. My voice cracked. 19 years old, talking to the admiral of the largest fleet my species had ever assembled, and my voice cracked like I was 12. Mr. Vale, Keene said, you refused evacuation. Yes, ma'am. Why? I looked at Ansha, at her pale, translucent skin and her frightened eyes. I looked at the monitor, at Chief Vorsi. I thought about the dried fruits and the beautiful sky and the 300 people who'd been kind to a strange human kid from a factory colony. Because they're good people, ma'am, I said. The Farron here, they didn't do anything. They tried to stop it. And they've been family to me out here. And I didn't think it was right to run and leave family behind just because I could. That's not, I swallowed. That's not what we do, is it? That's not what we're supposed to be. I didn't want to be someone who runs. The silence on the line was very long. No, Mr. Vale, Admiral Keene said at last, and I swear her voice was different now, some new thing in it that hadn't been there before. That is not what we do. That's exactly right. That's exactly what we're supposed to be. A pause. You stay with your people, son. You keep them safe and they'll keep you safe, and when this is over I'm going to want to shake your hand. There aren't many of us who'd have made that choice at 19. Your parents raised you right. And then, before I could answer, before I could even process what she'd said, her voice shifted back to that steady command register, and she was talking to Vorsi again, arranging the technical details of how the broadcast would work, and the moment was over. But I sat there for a long time afterward with my heart pounding, because I'd been so afraid of what my species had become. I'd spent 19 days terrified of the fleet, terrified of what the Vanguard meant, terrified that humanity had turned into something monstrous. And then the admiral of that fleet had taken 30 seconds in the middle of a war to tell a scared kid he'd done the right thing by not abandoning his friends. Monsters don't do that. Whatever the fleet was, whatever was coming behind it, it wasn't a monster. It was something else, something I didn't have a word for yet. Ansha did, though. Ansha had been listening to human transmissions for 5 weeks by then, and she'd started to understand us in a way almost no one in the galaxy did. She looked at me after the comm went quiet, and her skin had shifted to a color I hadn't seen before, not the fear gray, not the terror white, but something softer, something almost gold. I think I finally understand your people, she said quietly. It took me 5 weeks, but I think I finally understand. What do you understand? You're not cruel, she said. That's what everyone got wrong. The Coalition thought you'd be cruel if you ever fought back, cruel like they are, cruel the way strong things are cruel to weak things, but that's not it at all. She gestured vaguely at the comm, at the fleet hanging in the dark above us. You're not cruel. You're something much more dangerous than cruel. You're fair. Terribly, relentlessly fair. You'll cross a whole frontier to make the numbers balance, and you'll stop the instant they do, and not one moment before or after. You gave us a warning because Herrol's reach didn't get one. You noticed Vorsi tried to help. You thanked a boy for not running. Her gold skin flickered. The Coalition has no idea what's about to happen to them. They think they're being hunted by monsters. They're not. They're being audited. By accountants who happen to have a fleet. And there is nothing more implacable in the whole universe than someone who has decided calmly that a debt is going to be paid in full. I've thought about that word for 40 years. Audited. Ansha had it exactly right, and she saw it before anyone. The Coalition was about to be audited, and the auditor was already on its way. The broadcast started the next day. For the first few days, they were just transmissions, human voices and human data flowing through our relay into the inner Coalition systems. Admiral Keene had been true to her word. Nothing filtered, nothing softened, just the truth, laid out plain. The fleet transmitted the full record of Herrol's reach through our array. All of it. The recordings the Coalition military bloc had made themselves, thinking they were making an example, thinking the horror would cow humanity into submission. The fleet took those same recordings and broadcast them right back into the heart of Coalition space, so that every Coalition citizen could see exactly what had been done in their name. I helped run those broadcasts. It was my job, technically. I was a signals technician, and the relay was my station. So I sat at that console day after day, and I pushed the truth of Herrol's reach out into the galaxy, and I watched the Coalition's response come back. At first, the response was denial. The military bloc that had ordered the attack tried to claim the recordings were fabricated. Human propaganda. Lies designed to justify an unprovoked invasion. They flooded the channels with counter-transmissions, official statements, denials, and deflections. But here's the thing about the truth. When it's real and complete and you broadcast it without filtering, it's very hard to argue with. The recordings were the Coalition's own. Their own equipment, their own personnel, their own voices giving the orders. Ansha authenticated them, transmission by transmission. She could tell a real signal from a forged one the way you can tell a real smile from a fake one, instantly, at a level below thought. And she certified to anyone who asked that the recordings were genuine. The denial didn't hold. It couldn't. Within a week, the inner Coalition worlds were in an uproar. Because most Coalition citizens, the ordinary people, the ones who weren't part of the military bloc, most of them hadn't known. They'd been told there was a human problem on the frontier, a small aggressive new species making trouble. They hadn't been told what their own military had done at Herrol's reach. And when they found out, when our relay pushed the truth into their homes and they saw it with their own eyes, a lot of them were horrified. Genuinely, deeply horrified. That was when I started to understand that this wasn't a war between humanity and the Coalition. Not really. It was something more complicated and more sad than that. It was a war between humanity and a faction, the military bloc, the hardliners, the ones who decided that a species could be made an example of. And that faction had dragged the whole Coalition into the fire with them, whether the rest of the Coalition wanted to burn or not. Chief Vorsi understood this better than anyone. I found her in the monitoring station late one night, watching the response traffic come in, the horror, the outrage, the Coalition tearing itself apart over what had been done in its name, and she looked older than I'd ever seen her. This is what they never understood, she said, not really to me, more to herself. The hardliners, they thought strength was the only thing that mattered. They thought if they showed enough strength, everyone would fall in line, the humans, the frontier, everyone. They thought a massacre would make them respected. She shook her head slowly. And instead they've made themselves hated by their own people. The humans didn't even have to do that part. The hardliners did it to themselves. All the fleet had to do was hold up a mirror. Do you think the fleet knew? I asked. That broadcasting the truth would turn the Coalition against its own military bloc. Vorsi looked at me, and on her unreadable Farron face there was, for just a moment, something that might have been the ghost of a grim smile. Child, she said, your Admiral Keen knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't come here just to break a fleet. Anyone can break a fleet. She came to make sure that what happened at Herrol's Reach could never happen again, and the only way to do that is to make certain that the entire Coalition, every citizen of it, sees what it costs. Not fears it, sees it, understands it in their bones. She turned back to the traffic. The fleet is the Vanguard, Oren, but the broadcast is the real weapon. She's not conquering the Coalition. She's changing its mind. And a mind once changed stays changed long after the fleets go home. I didn't fully understand it then. I do now. Admiral Keen fought 2 wars at Tessel 9 at the same time through the same relay. One was the war everyone saw, the fleet, the fortress, the guns. And the other was the quiet war, the one fought with nothing but the truth, broadcast plain into the homes of a people who'd been lied to. And of the 2 wars, the quiet one mattered more. The quiet one is the reason the peace held afterward. The quiet one is the reason I'm able to sit here 40 years later and tell you this story in a galaxy that isn't at war. But the loud war came first, and it was about to get very, very loud. Because on the 8th day of the broadcasts, Ancha caught a new signal, faint, distant, coming from the far dark beyond the fleet from the direction the fleet had come. Something enormous was moving toward us. Something so large that at first Ancha thought her instruments were malfunctioning, because nothing that gave off a signal that size could possibly be a single object. It had to be a fleet, she thought. A second fleet, bigger than the first. But it wasn't a fleet. It was one thing, one single solitary object, and it was the size of a moon. Orin, Ancha said, and her skin had gone past white now, past translucent, into something I'd never seen and never saw again, a kind of colorless clarity like glass, like she'd become a window with nothing behind it. Orin, it's coming. The thing behind the Vanguard, it's finally coming. I looked at her instruments, at the signal, at the size of the thing that was moving toward us out of the dark. And I understood, finally, why Admiral Keen had kept saying the fleet is not the last thing you will see. The fleet wasn't the last thing. The fleet was just the door knocking. What came next was what walked through. It took the fortress 2 days to close the distance. 2 days. I want you to sit with that because it tells you something the numbers alone can't. When Ancha first caught the signal, the thing was so far out that light itself took time to cross the gap between it and us, and it closed that gap in 2 days. Something the size of a moon, moving fast enough to cross interstellar distance in 2 days, and it did it without so much as a flicker of strain in its signal. Whatever drove that thing, it drove it like the distance was nothing. Like the vastness of space was a hallway it was walking down. Those 2 days were the longest of my life, longer than the 19 before the fleet, because now we knew. We'd seen the Vanguard, we'd heard Admiral Keen, we'd watched the coalition tear itself apart over the broadcast truth of Herrol's reach, and now the thing behind all of it was coming, and we had 2 days to imagine what it might be. Ancha barely spoke during those 2 days. She sat at her console and she listened to the thing approach, and her skin stayed that colorless glass-clear shade, and every few hours she'd murmur some new measurement, some new impossible number, and each one was worse than the last. "It's bigger than I thought," she said on the first day, recalculating. "It's Orin, it's bigger than the moon we're standing on. It's bigger than Tessel 9. And on the second day, it has its own gravity, a real gravitational signature. I'm reading it bending the light of the stars behind it. Do you understand what that means? It's not a ship. Ships don't bend starlight. This is a world. They built a world and they pointed it at us." I remember trying to picture it and failing. My mind just couldn't hold the scale. I kept trying to imagine a ship so big it had gravity, so big it bent light, and my imagination kept sliding off the edges of it. It was too much. It was outside the range of things a human mind is built to picture. Chief Vorsey called the whole station together on the second day. All 311 of us, packed into the main assembly dome, Farron and the handful of other species who worked the station and me, the one human, standing near the front because Vorsey had asked me to. She stood up in front of all of them, this old gray-skinned woman, and she told them the truth. She always told them the truth. That was the kind of leader she was. She told them that a human object was approaching, larger than their moon. She told them she did not know exactly what it was or what it would do. She told them that Admiral Keen had given her word that no harm would come to the station, and that in Vorsey's judgment, for whatever it was worth, the Admiral was a person whose word could be trusted. And then she told them the thing I've never forgotten. "I have run this station for 60 years, Vorsey said. "In that time I have learned one thing above all others. Fear is a fire. It spreads and it consumes and it makes ash of everything it touches, courage, kindness, reason, all of it gone to ash. And the only thing that stops the fire of fear is the choice not to feed it." She looked out over the crowd, over all 300 of her people. "Whatever is coming, we will meet it with dignity. We will do our jobs. We will care for each other. We will not let the fear make ash of who we are. Because in the end, that is the only thing any of us ever truly controls, not what happens to us, but who we are when it happens. Let us be, whatever comes, people we would be proud to have been. Nobody applauded. That's not the Farron way. But I watched 300 frightened people stand a little straighter, and I watched the panic that had been building in that dome for 2 days settle into something quieter and stronger, and I understood that I was watching one of the great acts of leadership of my life, delivered by an old woman on a rock at the edge of nowhere, to an audience that history would never hear about. I've tried to live by those words, people we would be proud to have been. I haven't always managed it, but I've tried. 40 years I've tried. Let me tell you about the last night before the fortress arrived. Because I've never told this part to anyone, not fully, and I think it belongs in a true account. After Vorsi's speech in the assembly dome, the station settled into a strange, quiet calm. Not peace exactly, but something like acceptance. 300 people had been told the truth by a leader they trusted, and they'd decided more or less together that they would meet whatever came with dignity. And there's a kind of relief in that. Once you stop fighting the fear, once you stop trying to pretend it away, you can actually breathe again. The dread was still there. But it had stopped being a panic and become something quieter, a readiness. I couldn't sleep, though, naturally. The largest object in the galaxy was going to arrive over our heads at dawn, and I was supposed to sleep. So I did what I always did when I couldn't sleep. I went up to the observation tower. And I wasn't alone. Half the station was there. That surprised me. I climbed up into the tower expecting solitude, and instead I found it full, Farron and the handful of other station folk, standing quietly at the windows, looking out at the gas giant and the fleet and the dark beyond it where the fortress was coming. Nobody was talking much. They'd just come, the way I'd come, to be near the sky on the last night before everything changed. To look at the beautiful turning giant one more time, while it was still just a sky, and not the backdrop to history. I found a spot at the window. An old Farron miner stood next to me, a fellow named Kesh. I'd shared a few meals with him, a gruff old rock breaker with hands like shovels. He didn't say anything for a while. We just looked out together. Then he said in his slow, rumbling way, "You know what I keep thinking about." "What's that?" "Grandmother." He kept looking at the sky. "She used to tell me stories when I was small, old Farron stories from before the coalition, from when we were just tribes on the homeworld. And there was one about the end of the world, about a darkness that would come up over the horizon one day, bigger than any darkness before it, and swallow the stars. And everyone in the story was afraid because they thought the darkness was death." He was quiet a moment. "But in the story, the darkness wasn't death. It was a messenger. It came to tell the people something they needed to hear, and when they'd heard it, the darkness went away, and the stars came back, and the people were changed by what they'd learned." He turned to look at me, his old gray face unreadable in the dim light. "I keep thinking about that story, because tomorrow a darkness bigger than any we've seen is going to come up over that horizon and swallow the stars. And I find myself hoping, really hoping, that my grandmother's story was true. That it's a messenger and not death. That it's come to tell us something, and that when we've heard it, the stars will come back." I didn't know what to say. I was 19 and terrified, and I didn't have any wisdom to offer an old man on the last night of the world. But I thought about what Antje had told me, about the transmission, about what the thing wanted. "I think it is a messenger, Kesh," I said. "I really do. I've heard what it's saying. It's not coming for us. It's coming to say something to the whole galaxy, and we just happen to be where it's saying it. And I think when it said it's peace, the stars will come back. I think your grandmother was right." Kesh looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something I didn't expect. He reached out one of those huge shovel hands and put it on my shoulder, gently, the way you'd touch something breakable. "Thank you, human boy," he said, "for staying. Vorsi told us you could have left and you didn't. That means something to us. It means," he searched for the words, It means that whatever your people are out there in that darkness, they raised at least one who'd rather stand with strangers than run to safety. And if they raised one like that, maybe they raised more. Maybe the darkness really is a messenger. He patted my shoulder. You've made an old man less afraid tonight. I'll remember it, whatever comes. We stood there together, the old Farron miner and the young human, until the station dawn started to gray the horizon. And then the stars began to go out, the smooth, unbroken sweep of darkness rising up over the gas giant, and the whole tower went silent, and 300 people watched the largest thing in the galaxy come up over their horizon exactly like the darkness in an old Farron grandmother's story. And Kesh, standing beside me, whispered, "Messenger, please, let it be a messenger." It was. Thank God, thank every god of every species that ever prayed to one, it was a messenger. And when it had said its piece, the stars came back, just like the story promised. And we were all of us changed by what we'd learned. I never forgot Kesh. I looked for him years later when I was cataloging what became of everyone. He died of old age peacefully back on the Farron homeworld, surrounded by grandchildren. And I was told, this is the part that gets me, I was told that in his last years he became known for telling a story. A new one that he'd added to the old ones. A story about a darkness that came up over the horizon of a nothing moon and turned out to be a messenger, and about a young human who stayed when he could have run, and about how the stars came back. He told it to his grandchildren, over and over, the way his grandmother had told him her stories. So somewhere out there on the Farron homeworld, there are children who grew up hearing about me, about all of us, about the night the messenger came. Kesh made us into a story, the way his grandmother's people made the darkness into a story, and stories are how the Farron remember, the same as the fortress is how humanity remembers. Different methods, same purpose. We remember. Every species has its own way of saying it. That's the thing I understood, standing in that tower with Kesh. We're not so different, any of us. Human Farron, all of us, we all lose people, we all get afraid, and we all, every one of us, reach for the same thing in the end, a way to make sure that what mattered isn't forgotten. Humanity built a moon. The Farron tell stories to their grandchildren, but it's the same reaching. It's the same love pointed at the same darkness, saying the same two words. We remember. The fortress arrived at dawn. Station dawn, I mean the moment in the cycle when the distant sun crept up over the horizon and threw its thin light across the mining pits. I was in the observation tower again. Of course I was. Where else would I be? Antje was with me, and this time Chief Vorsi came too, the three of us standing at that high window looking out at the sky, waiting. The fleet was still there, hanging in the dark, all those cold, precise lights. And then beyond the fleet, out past the gas giant, the stars began to go out again, but not the way they had when the fleet arrived. When the fleet arrived, the stars vanished in patches, hundreds of small darknesses, one per ship. This was different. This time the stars didn't vanish in patches. This time a single vast darkness rose up over the curve of the gas giant. One darkness, growing, spreading, swallowing the stars not in patches but in a smooth, unbroken sweep, like a curtain being drawn across the universe, like night falling on night. And it kept growing, and kept growing. Long past the point where my mind said it had to stop. It kept growing, until it filled a third of the sky, until it dwarfed the gas giant, until it was the largest single thing any of us had ever seen or would ever see. The Colossal War Fortress. I don't have good enough words for it. I've tried for 40 years and I've never found words that do it justice, and I'm not going to pretend I've found them now. But I'll tell you what I saw. It was dark at first, a silhouette, a vast irregular mass blotting out the stars, and you couldn't make out any detail, just the sheer overwhelming size of it, the way it kept going and going past the edges of what you could take in. And then, as it settled into position above us, as it came to rest in the dark alongside the fleet that suddenly looked like a handful of fireflies next to it, the fortress lit itself up. And I fell to my knees. I'm not ashamed to say it. My legs just went out from under me. Because when that thing lit up, when its lights came on across its impossible surface, I saw what it was, and my body reacted before my mind could, and I went down onto my knees on the floor of that tower with my hands pressed against the glass. It was a city. That's the closest I can get. It was a city the size of a moon, built into the shape of a weapon. Its surface was a landscape, mountains of hull, valleys of armor, vast plains studded with structures I couldn't identify and didn't want to. Lights bloomed across it in their millions, the lights of a civilization that lived inside a thing built for war. There were spires that could have held cities of their own. There were cannons. I knew they were cannons, though each one was longer than the moon we stood on was wide, arranged along its flanks in ranks, and each one was dark and silent and waiting. There were docking bays big enough to swallow the entire Vanguard fleet, and I watched ships flowing in and out of them like blood cells through a heart. It turned slowly in the dark, and as it turned I saw its face, the great forward structure of it, the command prow, a cliff of dark metal miles high, and set into that cliff, vast enough to be read from orbit, was a single marking. Not a flag, not a national symbol. Just words. Human words in plain human letters, each one taller than a mountain, lit up so the whole system could read them. Antje read them aloud. Her voice was barely a whisper. It says, she stopped, started again. It says, we remember. That was the name of it. That was what humanity had named the largest thing it had ever built. Not something proud, not something fierce, not vengeance or retribution or conqueror. Just, we remember. Because that was the whole point. That was the entire message of the fortress, written across its face in letters a mountain tall. We remember Herrol's reach. We remember the colony. We remember the children. We remember, and we built a moon to make sure you never forget that we remember. And here it is, hanging over your frontier, so that 1,000 years from now when someone thinks about touching a human child again, they will remember too. Chief Vorsi made a sound I'd never heard a Farron make, a low sound from deep in her chest. I looked up at her from where I knelt on the floor, and I saw that her unreadable face was, for once, perfectly readable. She was weeping, silent, steady tears running down her gray face as she looked at that thing. They built a monument, she whispered. Do you see it, Oren? Do you see what they did? They didn't build a weapon. They built a monument, and they made it powerful enough that no one could ever tear it down. That's, her voice broke. In 60 years I have never seen anything like it. They took their grief and they made it into the largest thing in the galaxy, and they wrote we remember across its face, and they brought it here so the whole coalition would have to look at it. That is the most human thing I have ever seen. That is grief and love and rage, all built into one object the size of a world. I couldn't speak. I just knelt there with my hands on the glass, looking up at we remember burning in the dark, and I understood, finally and completely, what the coalition military bloc had done when they touched the children at Herrol's reach. They hadn't started a war. Wars end. Wars are fought over territory and resources and power, and when the fighting stops, the war is over and everyone goes home. This wasn't a war. This was a species building a moon-sized monument to its own murdered children and hauling it across the frontier so that the memory could never, ever die. This was permanent. This was humanity carving its grief into the bones of the galaxy in letters no one could ever erase. You can win a war. You cannot win against we remember. It isn't trying to win. It's just there, and it will always be there, remembering forever. The coalition military fleet arrived to challenge it 4 hours later. I'll give the hardliners this much. They were brave, or proud, or stupid. Sometimes those three things look exactly alike, and I've never been sure which it was. But when the reports reached the inner coalition that a human object the size of a moon was sitting over Tessel 9, the military bloc did not stand down. They did not surrender. They did not even negotiate. They gathered every warship they had, and they came to fight. It was a real fleet. I want to be fair to them. I've spent 40 years trying to be fair to everyone in this story, even the ones who did the unforgivable thing, because fairness is the only way to tell the truth. The coalition military fleet that arrived at Colossal 9 was genuinely formidable. Thousands of ships, real warships, built by an old and powerful civilization that had ruled its corner of the galaxy for millennia. They vastly outnumbered the human Vanguard. On paper, on any reasonable analysis, they should have been able to overwhelm the human fleet through sheer weight of numbers. They dropped out of the dark in their thousands on the far side of the system, and they formed up into battle lines. And for a moment, one brief moment, it looked like there was going to be a real fight. The human Vanguard was outnumbered, outgunned by the raw count of hulls. And the fortress was one object, however large, and one object can be surrounded, can be swarmed, can be brought down by enough fire from enough directions. That's what the coalition military command believed. I know they believed it because Ancha intercepted their command traffic, and their whole plan was built on it. Swarm the fortress, overwhelm the Vanguard, bring the moon down with numbers. They opened fire. I watched it from the tower. All three of us did. Vorsi had decided that if this was the end, we would face it with our eyes open. And so we stood at that window and we watched the coalition fleet open fire on the human positions. The sky lit up, thousands of weapons discharging at once, a storm of light crossing the dark toward the human Vanguard and the fortress. It was, in its horrible way, beautiful, the whole sky webbed with fire, more energy released in a single volley than that quiet system had seen in its entire existence. And then I learned what the fortress was for. Here is the thing nobody outside that system understood, until the recordings got out. Here is the thing that changed how the entire galaxy thought about humanity forever. The fortress did not fire back. Not at first. The coalition volley crossed the dark, thousands of weapons worth of fire, aimed at the human positions, and the fortress simply took it. Its shields or its armor, or whatever it was that protected that impossible surface, held. I watched the coalition fire break against the fortress like waves against a cliff, vast explosions blooming all across its miles of hull, and when the light faded, the fortress was still there, unmarked, unmoved. The words we remember still burning across its prow, not even flickering. And then Admiral Keen's voice came over every channel in the system, broadcast through our relay, through the fortress, through every frequency at once, so that every ship in the coalition fleet and every soul on Colossal 9 heard it at the same time. "Coalition fleet," she said, still calm, still without anger. "You fired your first volley. I let you. I wanted you to see what it does. Look at your instruments. Look at what your best shot accomplished." A pause. Nothing. It accomplished nothing. And I need you to understand that right now before anyone else dies, because what happens in the next 60 seconds is entirely your choice, and I want it to be an informed one. The coalition fleet held its position, not firing, listening. Even the hardliners were listening now. "I did not bring this station here to destroy your fleet," Keen went on. "I could. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only mercy I have left to offer you. This fortress could end every ship you have in the time it takes me to finish this sentence. It will not unless you force it. That is not weakness. You've made that mistake before. You saw restraint and you called it weakness, and it cost a colony full of children their lives. So let me be very clear about what this is. This is not weakness. This is a choice. I am choosing right now not to kill you, and I can go on choosing it or I can stop choosing it, and which one happens next depends entirely on what you do in the next 60 seconds. Silence across the system. The coalition fleet, thousands of ships hanging in the dark. "Here is what I want," Keen said. "I want the officers who ordered Herrol's reach. By name, I have the list. Your own records gave it to me. I want them, and I want them alive to answer for what they did before a court that the whole galaxy can watch. That's all. That's the entire debt. Not your fleet, not your worlds, not your people. 19 names, the ones who gave the orders." Hand them over and this ends, the fortress goes home, the fleet goes home, and the coalition and humanity begin the long, hard work of never letting this happen again. A pause. Refuse and protect them, and you make their crime your crime. You make yourselves into the thing they were. And then I stopped choosing. 60 seconds. Choose well. And then the count began. The fortress projected it across the sky, a number vast and clear, counting down, visible from every ship and every window in the system. 60, 59, 58. I have never in my life felt a tension like those 60 seconds. The whole system holding its breath. 300 Farron in a station, a human Vanguard, a moon-sized monument, thousands of coalition warships, and a number counting down in the sky, and every single one of us knowing that when it reached zero, one of two futures would begin, and we didn't know which. Antja's hand found mine again. She was that glass-clear color, colorless, transparent with terror. "They won't," she whispered. "The hardliners, they won't give up their own. Their whole philosophy is that you never show weakness, never yield, never admit fault. Surrendering the officers to them, that's the ultimate weakness. They'd rather die. They'd rather everyone die. Oren, they're going to let it hit zero." 40, 39, 38. And I thought she was right. I thought we were all about to watch a slaughter. I thought the hardliners' pride was going to kill every one of them, and maybe all of us too, because who knew what a battle of that scale would do to a little station caught in the middle of it. 2019, 18. And then something happened that none of us expected. Something that I have spent 40 years being grateful for, and that I think is the real heart of this whole story, the thing it was all secretly about the entire time. The coalition fleet started to break apart. Not in battle, not from human fire. It broke apart from the inside. Antja caught it first on her intercepts. Ship-to-ship traffic exploding across the coalition fleet, frantic, overlapping, 1,000 conversations at once. And what she heard, what she translated for me in real time, her voice shaking, was mutiny. The ordinary coalition sailors were refusing. You have to remember, they'd seen the broadcast. For 8 days, our relay had pushed the truth of Herrol's reach into every corner of coalition space, and these sailors, most of them, had seen it. They'd seen what their own military had done. They'd seen the children. And now here they were, being ordered to die, to protect the 19 officers who'd done it. To spend their lives shielding the very people who'd made them ashamed to wear the uniform. And they said no. It started on one ship. A cruiser called the Vale Tributary. I learned the name later. I made a point of learning it because it deserves to be remembered. The captain of the Vale Tributary, a Farron officer named Suldane, went on the open command channel with 15 seconds left on the count, and he said, Antja translated it, weeping as she did, he said, "This is Captain Suldane of the Vale Tributary. I will not order my crew to die for the butchers of Herrol's Reach. I have seen what they did. We have all seen what they did. The humans are not asking for our worlds or our lives. They are asking for justice, and they are right to ask, and I am ashamed that it took an alien fortress to make me say so out loud. My ship stands down. I am transmitting my position to the human command, and I am placing myself and my vessel at Admiral Keen's disposal. To my fellow captains, for the sake of everything we are supposed to be, stand down. Do not die for monsters. Do not become them." And then he powered down his weapons, on the open channel where everyone could see. 10 seconds. And another ship stood down, then 3 more, then a dozen. Then Antja was crying too hard to translate. She just pointed at the display, at the coalition fleet, where all across those thousands of ships the weapons were going dark, one after another, a wave of surrender rolling through the fleet faster than any order could travel, because it wasn't an order. It was 1,000 individual souls each deciding, in the same handful of seconds, that they would not die to protect the men who murdered children. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The count stopped. Admiral Keene stopped it herself at 3 seconds. The great number hanging in the sky simply froze and then faded, and her voice came back over every channel, and for the first time, the first and only time in this whole story, there was something other than calm in it. There was something that sounded almost like relief, almost like grief. The voice of someone who had been fully prepared to do a terrible thing and had just, at the last possible instant, been spared from having to do it. "Stand down, acknowledged," she said quietly. "All ships that have stood down, you are under human protection as of this moment. No harm will come to you. You did the hardest thing there is. You refused an unjust order and you did it in the open where it cost you something." A pause, and her voice thickened just slightly. "Captain Suldane, when this is over, there's going to be a new coalition built out of what comes next. I hope to God it's built by people like you. Thank you. From every human soul who lost someone at Herrol's Reach, thank you." And that was it. That was the Battle of Tessel 9. The largest confrontation of the entire war, the moment the whole galaxy held its breath. And it ended not with the fortress firing, but with a Farron captain named Suldane deciding he would rather be ashamed and alive and decent than proud and dead and complicit. The 19 officers were handed over within the hour, not by the humans, by their own fleet. The ships that had stood down surrounded the flagships where the officers had taken shelter, and they took them into custody themselves, coalition arresting coalition, and they delivered the 19 to Admiral Keene to face the court she'd promised. The fortress never fired a shot. In the largest military operation in human history, the Colossal war fortress we remember never fired a single shot in anger. It didn't have to. Its whole purpose was to be so overwhelming, so absolute, so clearly beyond any possibility of resistance, that the fight would end before it began, that the only real choice left would be the choice between justice and annihilation, laid out so starkly that even the proudest hardliner's own crew would refuse to choose wrong. Antje understood it in the end better than I did. She always understood humanity better than I did, which is a strange thing to say about my own species, but it's true. She'd studied us from the outside, and sometimes the outside is where you see a thing most clearly. "It was never meant to fire," she said that night as we watched the 19 officers being taken into custody on the displays. "Do you see it now? The whole thing, the fleet, the fortress, all of it, it was never meant to fire. It was meant to make firing unnecessary. Keene built the most powerful weapon in the history of the galaxy, and she built it for one reason, so that she would never have to use it, so that the choice would be so obvious that even monsters' own crews would make the right one." Her skin had finally shifted back toward its normal color, the terror draining out of her at last. That's the most human thing of all, I think. Not the power. Any species can build power. The human thing was building all that power, and then bending every ounce of it, every bit of that impossible strength, toward the goal of not having to kill anyone, toward making mercy the only sane option left on the table. She looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, Antje Rue smiled. "Your people are terrifying," she said, "and I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong about someone. But I'm not finished, because the story of Tessel 9 doesn't end with the surrender or the arrests or the fortress hanging peaceful in the dark. It ends with what came after, with the trial and the truth of it, and the thing Admiral Keene did at the very end that no one, not the coalition, not the galaxy, not even the human fleet, ever expected. But before I get to that, I have to tell you about the days in between. Because the days in between are where I learned the things I've carried longest. The trial did not happen at Tessel 9. It happened later and elsewhere, and the whole galaxy watched it, and you can read about it in any history you like. But the preparation for it happened at Tessel 9, because our relay was the only working node for light years, and Admiral Keene wanted the whole thing broadcast, transparent, complete, unfiltered through our array, the same way she'd broadcast the truth of Herrol's Reach. So the fortress stayed. For 3 weeks, The colossal war fortress we remember hung in the sky above our little moon, and I lived my days under the shadow of the largest thing my species had ever built, and I learned what it was actually like to have that thing as a neighbor. It was strange. I'll tell you the honest, human, ground-level truth of it, the part the histories never mention. After the first few days, we got used to it. You can get used to anything. A moon-sized fortress hanging in your sky becomes, after a week, just the sky. The mind adjusts. The Farron went back to their mining. The greenhouse kept growing its dried fruits. I ran my relay shifts, pushing trial preparations and legal filings and diplomatic traffic out into the galaxy. And above me the fortress turned slowly in the dark. Its cannons silent, its lights burning. We remember wheeling across the sky with the rotation of the moon. Human crews started coming down to the station. That was the strangest part and the best part. Once the surrender was complete and the situation stable, Admiral Keene authorized shore rotations, human sailors, coming down from the fleet and the fortress to walk on solid ground, to breathe unrecycled air, to stand under an alien sky that wasn't trying to kill them. And Tessel 9, our little nothing rock, became the place they came. I met them, my own people, for the first time in over a year. And they were not what I'd feared back when I stood in that tower watching the stars go out. They weren't monsters. They weren't berserkers drunk on vengeance. They were tired. That's the thing I remember most. They were bone-tired, sad-eyed men and women who'd crossed a frontier to answer for a massacre, and who carried the weight of what they'd been prepared to do like a stone in the chest. A lot of them had lost people at Herrol's reach, family, friends, people from their home colonies. They'd volunteered for the Vanguard because they couldn't do nothing. And now that it was ending, now that it had ended without the slaughter everyone expected, they were carrying the strange, complicated grief of people who'd prepared themselves to become something terrible and had been spared at the last moment from having to. I talked to one of them for a long time. A gunner off the fortress itself, a woman named Petra Coyle, maybe 40, with gray coming into her hair and a quietness about her. She'd been assigned to one of the great cannons, one of the ones longer than our moon was wide, and her whole job for the entire campaign had been to be ready to fire it. "I'm glad I never did," she told me. We were sitting in the station commissary, drinking the terrible tea, and she was looking at nothing. That's the thing nobody tells you about a weapon like that. You train for it. You drill and drill and drill. And the whole time underneath you're praying you never have to use the thing you're training for, because I know what my gun does. I've seen the numbers. If I'd fired it even once, she stopped, shook her head. There wouldn't have been enough left of that coalition fleet to bury, and they were people. Most of them were just people, following orders, same as me. I'd have killed 100,000 people who were mostly just scared kids in uniforms to make 19 monsters pay. She looked at me. The Admiral knew that. That's why she built it the way she built it, big enough that we'd never have to fire it. She spent, do you have any idea what a thing like that costs to build? She spent the wealth of whole worlds so that I would never have to pull that trigger, so I could go home still able to look at myself. Petra Coyle's eyes were wet. That's the part I'll never be able to explain to anyone back home, that the biggest gun ever built was really an act of mercy, that every ounce of that power existed so it would never have to be used. People are going to look at that fortress in the history books and see a weapon. It wasn't a weapon. It was the Admiral's way of loving us enough to keep our hands clean. I've thought about Petra Coyle as much as anyone in this story. A gunner who spent a war praying she'd never fire her gun, and got her prayer answered, and understood exactly what it had cost and exactly why it was worth it. Antje spent those 3 weeks slowly coming back to herself. I need to tell you about that because it matters, and because it's the part of the story that's really about healing rather than power, and in the end I think the healing is the point. The weeks of listening had nearly destroyed her. All that time with the headphones on, catching the transmissions, translating the horror of Herrol's reach, being the first mind in the whole system to understand what was coming, it had worn her down to almost nothing. There was a stretch, right around when the fortress arrived, where I genuinely feared for her. Where she'd go that glass-clear colorless shade and stay there for hours, unresponsive, somewhere far away inside herself. But once it was over, once the surrender came and the killing didn't, she started slowly to come back. The color returned to her skin, first in flickers, then in longer stretches. She started eating again, sleeping. One day I heard her laugh at something, a real laugh, the first one in weeks, and I had to leave the room for a minute because it hit me so hard. We talked a lot in those 3 weeks, about what she'd heard and what it had done to her and what it meant. And one evening, I remember it exactly, we were up in the observation tower, the fortress turning slow above us. We remember wheeling across the sky. She told me something I've never forgotten. I used to think I understood language, she said. 311 of them. I thought I understood how people talk, what words are for, all of it. And then I spent 5 weeks listening to your species, and I realized I'd had it backwards my whole life. She was quiet for a moment, watching the fortress. I thought language was for communication, for passing information from one mind to another. But that's not what your fortress is, Oren. Your fortress is language. The biggest sentence anyone ever spoke. 2 words we remember, written so large that the whole galaxy has to read them and will keep reading them for 1,000 years. That's not communication. That's something else. That's a species refusing to let a truth die, refusing to let its dead be forgotten. Building a monument so vast that forgetting becomes impossible. She turned to me. I've spent my whole life learning to translate languages, and it took your terrible, beautiful people to teach me what language is actually for. It's for this. It's for saying we remember and making it stick and making it matter forever. She's the reason I can tell this story in a way. Aunt Cheru. She's the one who taught me how to see it, not as a war, not as a display of power, but as an act of remembering. As the largest sentence anyone ever spoke, hanging in the sky, refusing to let the children of Herrol's reach be forgotten. Chief Vorsi and Admiral Keen met, finally, near the end of the 3 weeks, in person. Keen came down from the fortress herself, the admiral of the largest fleet in human history, walking into our little station in a plain uniform with no ceremony and no guard, to shake the hand of an old Farron station chief who tried to warn a galaxy that wouldn't listen. I was there. Vorsi asked me to be. She said I was the bridge between the 2 of them, the human who'd become Farron or the Farron who'd stayed human. She was never quite sure which, and neither was I, so I stood in that room and I watched the 2 of them meet. And it's one of the great privileges of my life that I did. Keen was older than her voice had made her sound. Gray-haired, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much and hadn't looked away from any of it. And when she took Vorsi's 6-fingered gray hand in both of hers, the first thing she did was thank her. You tried to stop this, Keen said. 5 weeks you tried. You called every authority you could reach and told them we were coming and begged them to make it right before it came to this. Nobody listened. But you tried, and I want you to know that if they had listened, if even one of them had listened to you, none of this would have been necessary. The fortress would never have been built. Herrol's reach would still be. She stopped. Her jaw worked. You did everything right, Chief Tell. The failure was never yours. I need you to know that. Whatever you carry out of this, don't carry that. And Vorsi, old, unreadable Vorsi, who I'd only seen weep once at the sight of the fortress, Vorsi's composure cracked just slightly, and she said, I keep thinking, if I had called sooner, if I had been louder, if I had made someone listen. No, Keen said, firm, gentle. That way lies madness, and you don't deserve it. You were one voice on a rock at the edge of nowhere, screaming into a system built not to hear you. The fault is with the system and with the monsters who ran it, and with no one else. Not with you, not ever with you. She squeezed Vorsi's hand. You be at peace, Chief Tell. You did more than almost anyone. You be at peace. I watched an old alien woman and an old human woman hold each other's hands in a little room on a nothing moon, both of them carrying more grief than a person should have to carry, and I watched them set a little of it down together by giving each other permission to. And I thought, this This is what the fortress was for, not the guns. This. Two grieving people from two species that had almost gone to war, finding in each other the permission to lay down a piece of the weight. The power was never the point. The power was just what made this moment possible. The moment was the point. The 19 officers stood trial 3 months later before a court that the whole galaxy watched, broadcast through relays across settled space. And it began, the very first transmission of it, through our little array on Tessel 9, because Admiral Keen insisted. She said the trial should start where the surrender happened. She said Tessel 9 had earned it. I won't recount the trial here. It's history. You can study it. The 19 were convicted, all of them, on evidence so complete and so damning that even their own defenders barely contested it. Herrol's reach was answered for. The debt Admiral Keen had crossed a frontier to collect was paid in full before a galactic court in the light of day where everyone could see. But there's one thing about the trial that isn't in most of the histories, and it's the thing I most want you to know, because it's the thing that tells you who Admiral Sarah Keen really was, underneath the fortress and the fleet and the terrible calm. When the convictions came down, the court asked the human representative, Keen herself, appearing as the injured party's commander, what sentence humanity sought for the 19, and everyone expected death. The whole galaxy expected death. These were the butchers of Herrol's reach. They had murdered children. Humanity had built a moon to answer for it. Of course humanity would demand their lives. Keen stood up in that court, in front of the watching galaxy, and she said no. She said humanity did not seek their deaths. She said that killing them would make them martyrs to the hardliners who still, even now, believed the massacre had been justified, and that a dead monster is more dangerous than a living one, because you can tell any story you like about the dead. She said humanity sought instead that the 19 live, that they live long lives in confinement, and that every year on the anniversary of Herrol's reach, the full record of what they did be broadcast across the galaxy again, with their names attached, so that they would grow old watching the truth of their crime told and retold, unable to hide from it, unable to escape it, unable ever to be anything other than the men who did the thing that built the fortress. Death is an ending, Keen told the court. They don't get an ending. Endings are mercy. What they did doesn't get mercy. It gets remembered. Let them live and let them be remembered exactly and precisely as what they are for the rest of their natural lives. That is the sentence humanity seeks, not death, memory. Because we are the species that remembers, and we are going to make certain they remember too, every single day, until the day they die of old age with the truth still ringing in their ears. The court granted it, and somewhere out there, for all I know, 1 or 2 of those 19 might still be alive even now, very old in confinement, watching the record of Herrol's reach play again on its anniversary, their names attached, unable to look away. We remember. Keen meant it as a promise and a threat and a sentence all at once. And she made it stick. She made it stick forever. The fortress left Tessel 9 the day after the trial began. I watched it go from the tower with Antje and Vorsi beside me, the 3 of us, one last time at that high window. The great dark shape unmoored itself from our sky, slow and enormous, and we remember wheeled one final time across the stars, and then it began to move off toward the deep dark, back the way it had come, back toward human space and whatever waited for it there. It took the Vanguard with it, and the surrendered coalition ships, the ones who'd stood down, sailed off in a different direction, toward the hard work of building whatever the coalition would become now. Captain Sull Dane's cruiser among them, the Vale tributary, leading the way as I thought it should. And then the sky was just the sky again. The gas giant, turning slow and banded and beautiful. The stars all back in their places, none of them blotted out, as if none of it had ever happened. But it had happened, and nothing was the same. Not the galaxy, not the coalition, not humanity's place among the stars, and not me, especially not me. Because I'd stayed. When I could have run, I'd stayed. And I'd seen the whole thing from the first quiet station going dark to the last turn of the fortress in the sky. And I understood, standing in that tower watching we remember sail off into the deep, that I would spend the rest of my life telling people what I'd seen. That it had become my job somehow, without anyone assigning it to me. To remember. To be one of the ones who remembers. Let me tell you the rest. Let me tell you what it all meant, in the end, and what happened to the people I loved on that nothing rock at the edge of everything. I stayed on Colossal 9 for another 2 years after the fortress left. People are always surprised by that. They expect the story to end with the fortress sailing off into the dark, the big dramatic image, the credits rolling. But real life doesn't end where the drama does. Real life keeps going. The relay still needed running. The Farron still needed a signals technician. And I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't want to leave. I'd come to that nothing rock a factory colony kid who just wanted to see something. And I'd seen it. I'd seen more than almost anyone alive. And somewhere in all of it, Colossal 9 had stopped being a place I was visiting and started being home. The gas giant turning in the sky. The dried fruits. The terrible tea. Chief Vorsi's grandmotherly disapproval of my sleeping habits. Antje at the console beside me, teaching me to hear the shapes of languages I'd never understand. I didn't want to leave that. Not yet, so I stayed. And I want to spend the last part of this telling you about those 2 years, and about what happened to the people in this story afterward, because the fortress isn't really what the story is about. I know it's in the title. I know it's the thing that makes people want to hear this in the first place. The Colossal War Fortress, the biggest thing humanity ever built, hanging in an alien sky. And it's real, all of it, exactly as I've told it. But it's not the point. The point is the people. It's always the people. The fortress was just the thing that happened to them. Let me tell you about the people. Antje Rue never fully went back to who she'd been before. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to give you a clean, happy ending, and this story has earned better than easy. The 5 weeks of listening, of being the first mind to understand what was coming, of carrying that knowledge alone before anyone believed her, those weeks left a mark on her that never entirely faded. She had bad nights sometimes, for the rest of the time I knew her. Nights where she'd go that pale flat gray and I'd find her at the console with the headphones on, listening to empty frequencies, listening for the next terrible thing coming out of the dark. There wasn't a next terrible thing, but some part of her never stopped listening for it. That's what that kind of experience does. It teaches you the universe can go wrong without warning, and once you've learned that, you can't unlearn it. But she healed mostly, in the ways that matter. She laughed again, really laughed, often, that laugh that had knocked me flat the first time I heard it come back. She went back to loving language, to being fascinated by the endless variety of how the universe's peoples talk to each other. And she found, in the aftermath, a new purpose that I think saved her. She became a teacher. The trial and its broadcast had made Antje somewhat famous, in the quiet way that experts become famous. She was the xenolinguist who'd first identified the human Vanguard, who'd authenticated the Herrol's Reach recordings, whose certification had helped turn the whole coalition against its own military bloc. And she used that. She took it, and she built something with it. She started teaching first at Colossal 9, informally, to the station's young people, and then, after I left, at institutions across the reformed coalition. She taught languages, yes, but more than that, she taught what she'd learned from us, from humanity. She taught what she'd figured out in that observation tower with the fortress turning overhead. That language is for remembering. That the point of learning to understand each other is so that we never again mistake patience for weakness, or kindness for the absence of strength, or a quiet people for a safe target. She wrote a book eventually, a famous one. You may have read it. It's taught in schools across half the settled galaxy now. It's about humanity, about what she learned watching us from the outside during those weeks at Colossal 9. And the thesis of it, the thing the whole book is built around, is the thing she said to me in the tower. That humanity's defining trait is not our strength, and not our capacity for violence, but our refusal to forget. That we are the species that remembers. And that this is at once the most beautiful and the most dangerous thing about us. The last line of her book is the line she said to me the night the fortress arrived. I've always been quietly proud that I heard it first, before it was famous, before it was in every school. She wrote, "They are not cruel. That is what everyone gets wrong. They are something far more dangerous than cruel. They are fair. And there is nothing in all the universe more implacable than a gentle people who have finally, after much patience, decided that a debt will be paid in full." Antje lived a long life. Longer than mine will be, most likely. Her species outlasts mine by decades. She's still alive as I write this. Very old now, very honored, still teaching when her health allows. We write to each other still after 40 years. Her letters always end the same way. "Still listening," she writes, "but the dark is quiet now. Thank you for staying all those years ago. I don't think I'd have made it through those weeks without the strange, out-of-breath human boy who wouldn't leave. I don't think I'd have made it through them without her either. We saved each other a little on that nothing rock. That's the kind of thing that doesn't make it into the histories, but it's the kind of thing that's actually worth remembering." Chief Vorsi retired the year after I left. 61 years running that relay station, and she finally set it down. She'd earned it 100 times over. And the coalition, the new coalition, the one being built out of the wreckage of the old, did not let her retire quietly. They couldn't. Because by then everyone knew her story. The old station chief who'd spent 5 weeks screaming a warning that no one would hear, who tried harder than anyone in the whole coalition to prevent the war before it came. She became a symbol in her last years. Of the coalition that should have been, of the voice of reason that the old order had ignored to its ruin. The reformers held her up as proof that the disaster had been preventable, that there had been people who saw it coming and tried to stop it, and that the failure was not inevitable but chosen by the hardliners who wouldn't listen. Vorsi hated the attention in her patient, unreadable Farron way. But she understood why it mattered, and so she endured it. And she used what platform it gave her to argue always for the same thing. Listen to the quiet voices. Listen to the people on the nothing rocks at the edge of everything. Because sometimes they're the only ones who can see what's coming, and the cost of ignoring them is a fortress in your sky. I went back to visit her years later. She was very old by then, in a care facility on one of the inner coalition worlds, and her mind wandered sometimes, the way the very old sometimes wander. But she knew me. The moment I walked in, her unreadable face did that thing it had done only a few times in all the years I'd known her. It became readable, warm, unmistakably glad. "The human boy who wouldn't leave," she said. "You came back." "I came back, Chief." She took my hand in her 6-fingered one, thin now, the gray gone pale, and she said, "Did I ever tell you why I offered to evacuate you, when the fleet was coming? You said it was because I was human, that they wouldn't harm me." "That was the reason I gave you," she said. "It wasn't the real reason," she smiled faintly. "The real reason was that I loved you like my own foolish child, and I could not bear the thought of you being here for the horror I was certain was coming. I thought the humans would burn us all. I thought I was sending you away from a massacre. I wanted you to live." Her hand tightened on mine. "And you refused. You looked at an old alien woman and 300 people who weren't your kind, and you said you wouldn't leave your family behind. Do you know what that did to me, Oren? In that moment, when I was certain we were all about to die," her eyes were wet, "it gave me back my faith. In everyone, in all the peoples of the galaxy. Because if a 19-year-old human boy would choose to die beside strangers rather than abandon them, then maybe we were all worth saving after all. Maybe the universe wasn't only cruelty and fortresses. Maybe there was something in all of us worth the trouble." She patted my hand. "You gave an old woman back her hope on what she thought was the last day of her life. I never told you that. I'm telling you now. Before I forget how. I stayed with her for 3 days. She died about a month after I left. Peacefully, they told me, in her sleep under the care of people who honored her. I like to think she died with her hope intact. I think she did. I did what I could to make sure of it. At her memorial, they read out the record of what she'd done, the 5 weeks of warnings, the calls no one answered, the dignity with which she'd led 300 frightened people through the arrival of the largest object in the galaxy. And they gave her a title posthumously that I think she'd have found embarrassing and that I think was exactly right. They called her the voice that tried, because she did try, harder than anyone. And even though no one listened in time, the trying mattered. The trying is why the reformers had a hero to point to. The trying is part of why the new coalition got built better than the old one. Listen to the quiet voices. That's Vorsi's whole legacy if you boil it down. Listen to the quiet voices on the nothing rocks. It's advice the galaxy paid a terrible price to learn, and I hope to God it doesn't forget it. I want to tell you about Captain Saldane, because he's the one people forget, and he shouldn't be, because in a lot of ways he's the most important person in this entire story. Think about what he did. Really think about it. 15 seconds left on Admiral Keen's count, a moon-sized fortress in the sky. His entire civilization's military honor demanding that he fight, that he never yield, that he die rather than surrender the officers his own command structure had ordered him to protect. Everything he'd been raised to believe, everything his uniform meant, every instinct of loyalty and duty and pride, all of it screaming at him to hold the line and go down fighting. And instead, with the whole galaxy watching, with 15 seconds on the clock, he went on the open channel and said he would not order his crew to die for butchers. That took more courage than anything the humans did. I believe that with my whole heart, and I'm human and I was there. The humans had the fortress. They had overwhelming power. When you have the biggest gun in the galaxy, standing firm isn't quite as hard, you know you can't lose. But Saldane had nothing. No power. No certainty. He didn't know the fleet would follow him. For all he knew, he was about to be the only captain who broke ranks, branded a traitor by his own people, executed for cowardice, his name a curse for 1,000 years. He had every reason to believe that standing down would cost him everything and accomplish nothing. And he did it anyway, because it was right, because he'd seen the recordings and he could not, would not, spend the lives of his crew to shield the men who'd murdered children. That's the bravest thing in this whole story. A man with no power, no certainty, and everything to lose, choosing to do the right thing in the open where it would cost him, and trusting, against all the evidence, that others would find the courage to follow. They did follow. That's the thing. His courage turned out to be contagious. The moment he stood down, he gave every other captain in that fleet permission to do the same, permission to admit what they'd all been feeling, the shame, the horror, the desperate wish not to die for monsters. One man found the courage first, and it spread through a fleet of thousands in seconds, because courage is like that. It's the rarest thing in the universe right up until one person shows it. And then, sometimes, it's the most common thing in the universe, because it turns out everyone was just waiting for permission. Saldane became a founding figure of the new coalition. Of course he did. The reformers built the whole new order partly around his example, the officer who put conscience above orders, who proved that duty to what's right outranks duty to the chain of command. There are academies named after him now. Coalition officers, to this day, study the moment he stood down as the defining example of what military honor actually means, not blind obedience, but the courage to refuse an unjust order and accept the cost. I met him too, years later. I made a point of it. I traveled to meet as many of the people in this story as I could, while they were still alive, because I understood even then that I was going to spend my life telling it, and I wanted to tell it true. Saldane was an old Farron by the time I met him, retired, gruff, uncomfortable with his own fame in exactly the way Vorsi had been. I asked him how he'd found the courage, in those 15 seconds, to be the first. He looked at me like it was a strange question. I didn't find courage, he said. I ran out of the ability to pretend. That's different. For 8 days I'd been watching those broadcasts, same as everyone, watching what we did at that colony. And every day it got harder to keep telling myself it wasn't my problem, that I was just following orders, that it wasn't my place to judge. And then the count started and I had 15 seconds and I just couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't make my mouth say the words that would order my crew to die protecting those men. The pretending ran out. That's all it was. It wasn't courage. It was just the moment the lie finally became impossible to keep telling. I've thought about that a lot. The moment the lie became impossible to keep telling. I think that's how most real courage actually works when you look at it up close. It's not some grand, heroic surge. It's just the moment when you can no longer stand to be part of the thing you know is wrong, and the not standing it finally outweighs the fear. Dane didn't feel brave. He felt like he'd simply reached the end of his capacity to participate in something monstrous. And that turned out to be enough. That turned out to be the thing that saved 100,000 lives and turned a war into a reckoning instead of a slaughter. Be the person who runs out of the ability to pretend. That's what I take from Dane. When the lie gets big enough, when the wrong thing is happening right in front of you, be the one who can't keep pretending, even when everyone around you still can. Because you might be the first. And the first is the one who gives everyone else permission to be the second, and the third, and the 1,000th. The new coalition took years to build, and I watched a lot of it happen through the relay before I left Tessel 9. I want to tell you about it because it's the part that makes all the rest of it worth something. A massacre and a fortress and a trial, those are just events, just history, just things that happened. What makes them matter is what got built afterward. And what got built afterward was, against all odds, better than what came before. The old coalition had been run by the military bloc, the hardliners, the ones who believed strength was the only law and that a species that wouldn't fight for respect didn't deserve it. That bloc didn't survive Herrol's reach. Not because humanity destroyed it, humanity barely fired a shot, but because the coalition's own people destroyed it once they saw, through our broadcasts, what it had done in their name. The mutiny at Tessel 9 wasn't just a battlefield event. It was the beginning of a revolution. Captain Dane standing down was the first crack, and once that crack opened, the whole rotten structure came apart, because it turned out almost nobody had really believed in it. They'd just been afraid, or going along, or pretending, until one man made pretending impossible. The reformers who rebuilt the coalition built it around a different idea, not strength as the only law. Something Vorsi had spent her whole life arguing for, something Antje wrote her famous book about, something the whole terrible experience had burned into the galaxy's understanding, that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats the strong, but how it treats the weak, that a power which preys on the helpless is not strong at all, but is in fact the weakest thing there is, so frightened of its own smallness that it has to prove itself against those who can't fight back. And that real strength, true strength, is the kind that protects, the kind that remembers, the kind that could bring the biggest gun in history to bear and chooses instead to make mercy possible. They wrote that into the founding documents of the new coalition. In language borrowed, they freely admitted, from what they'd learned watching humanity at Tessel 9. The new coalition and humanity became allies, not immediately, not easily, but steadily, over years, because they'd learned the hardest possible lesson about each other and come out the other side with something like understanding. The species that had almost gone to war became, in time, partners in building something neither could have built alone. And Herrol's reach became a shared thing. That surprised me most of all. I'd expected the colony to stay a purely human wound, a purely human memorial. But the new coalition claimed it too, in a way not to diminish the human grief, but to share the weight of it. Coalition citizens make pilgrimages to Herrol's Reach now, to stand under the turning prow and read we remember and grieve, alongside humans, for what one faction of their own people did. They remember it as their shame and humanity's wound, both at once, held together. And there's something profound in that, something that heals in a way that vengeance never could have. The species that committed the massacre and the species that suffered it, standing together under the same two words, grieving the same dead, promising the same promise. Never again. That's what got built. That's what the fortress was actually for. Not to punish the coalition, to change it, to burn away the rot and leave room for something better to grow. And it worked. It actually worked. 40 years later, the galaxy I'm old in is a kinder place than the galaxy I was young in. And the reason, a good part of the reason, is a moon-sized monument that never fired a shot, and the terrible grief that built it, and the mercy that guided it, and the people on all sides who chose, in the crucial moments, to be better than the worst thing that had been done. I kept in touch with Petra Coyle too, the gunner, the one who spent a war praying she'd never fire her gun. We wrote to each other for years after Tessel 9. She'd given me an address before the fleet left, said if I ever wanted to talk to someone who understood, she'd be there. And I took her up on it more than once, because it turned out I did need someone who understood, and there weren't many. Most people who hear this story marvel at it. Petra didn't marvel. Petra had been inside it the way I had. She knew. She left the service after the war. She told me she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't sit at a weapon, even a decommissioned one, even in peacetime. Something had changed in her during those weeks of holding her finger over a trigger that could end 100,000 lives. She'd come to understand the weight of that kind of power in a way that made it impossible to ever pick up again. So she put it down. She went home to her human colony world, and she became, of all things, a teacher of young children. The very young ones, 5- and 6-year-olds. I asked her once why. Why, after everything, she'd chosen to spend her days with tiny children. Because they're the whole point, she wrote back. The children, that's what the whole war was about, wasn't it? What happened to the children at Herrol's Reach? That's why the fortress got built. That's why I sat at that gun. Everything, all of it was about children. And when it was over, I thought, if I spent all that time ready to kill 100,000 people to protect the memory of some murdered children, then maybe the best thing I can do with the rest of my life is protect some living ones. Teach them. Keep them safe. Give them a good start. Be, for the children in front of me, the thing the galaxy failed to be for the children of Herrol's Reach. She added at the end, it's the only thing that makes the gun make sense. I sat at a weapon of unimaginable destruction, and I came away from it wanting nothing in the whole universe except to keep small children safe and happy. I don't know if that's healing or damage, but it's what I've got, and it's good work, and I sleep better than I have any right to. Petra Coyle taught small children for 30 years. She died about 5 years ago. At her funeral I went, of course. There were hundreds of grown men and women who'd been her students as children, come to say goodbye to the teacher who'd kept them safe and happy in their earliest years. Not one of them knew she'd once sat at the largest gun ever built. She never told them. She'd left that behind completely. To them she was just Miss Coyle, who taught them their letters and dried their tears and made them feel safe. And I stood at the back of that funeral and I thought, that's the truest kind of monument there is. Not a fortress, not a prow turning over a dead world. A room full of grown people who are gentler than they'd otherwise have been, because one former gunner decided to spend her life protecting children instead of being ready to avenge them. The gun made her, in the end, into the opposite of a gun. I think that would have pleased Admiral Keene enormously. I wrote to Keene about it once, years later before she died, told her what Petra had become. She wrote back a single line. That, she said, is the only victory that was ever worth the fortress. I've kept that letter. I keep it still. I should tell you a little about my own life too, since I've told you about everyone else's. It's only fair. I married. Later than most. I was well into middle age before I settled, because for a long time I couldn't stay still, couldn't stop traveling and telling the story. But eventually I met someone. Another human, a historian as it happened, someone who'd spent her career studying the war I'd lived through, and who knew more about the politics of it than I ever would, even though I'd been standing right there when the fortress came. We used to argue about it in the good way. She'd tell me the strategic significance of some decision, and I'd tell her what it actually smelled like in that station, what Vorsi's face actually looked like. And between the two of us, we had the whole thing, the history and the humanity, the facts and the feeling. We had children, 2 of them, and I told them the story, of course, earlier than I probably should have. Honestly, they were quite young the first time. But I wanted them to know. Not because I wanted them to be proud of what humanity did, though there's things in it to be proud of, but because I wanted them to understand the thing it taught me. The thing I've spent this whole telling trying to give to you. That being decent when you're afraid is the only decency that counts. That the quiet voices are worth listening to. That strength is for making fighting unnecessary, not for winning fights. That you should be the one who runs out of the ability to pretend. And that the most important thing any of us ever does, more important than any fortress, any fleet, any grand act of history, is simply to remember. To refuse to let what mattered be forgotten. To keep the light on for the ones who came before, and to pass it forward to the ones who come after. My children are grown now. They have children of their own. And a few years ago, my oldest granddaughter, she was maybe 7, asked me to tell her the fortress story. She'd heard bits of it, the way children hear bits of family legend, and she wanted the whole thing. So I told her. The whole thing, start to finish, the way I've told you. And when I got to the end, to the part about staying when I could have run, she was quiet for a long time, the way children get quiet when something's landed deep. And then she said, "Grandpa, I'm glad you stayed." "Why's that?" She thought about it with tremendous seriousness, and then she said, "Because if you'd left, you wouldn't have been you, and then you wouldn't have been my grandpa, not really. You'd have been someone else, someone who ran." Out of the mouths of children. She was 7, and she understood it better than most of the historians. That the choice to stay wasn't just about that night. It was about who I was going to be for the rest of my life. It made me into the person who stayed, and everything after, the marriage and the children and the grandchildren and this whole life of remembering and telling. All of it grew out of that one choice, made at 19, scared out of my mind, in a tower under an alien sky. If I'd run, I'd have been someone who ran, and I'd have carried that forever, and it would have quietly poisoned everything, and my granddaughter was right, I wouldn't really have been me. I wouldn't really have been her grandpa. Some other, smaller man would have been sitting in my chair. I'm so glad I stayed. Every single day of my life I've been glad I stayed. It's the thing I'm proudest of out of everything, and I didn't even do anything heroic. I just didn't leave. Sometimes that's the whole of it. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to abandon the people who need them, and then live long enough to understand what that refusal was worth. I'm an old man now. I left Tessel 9 eventually, 2 years after the fortress, like I said. I went home for a while, and then I didn't stay home because home didn't feel like home anymore after everything. I traveled. I told the story. That became my life without my ever quite deciding it would. I became one of the ones who remembers, one of the ones who tells it, so that the people who weren't there can understand what happened and why it mattered and what it cost. I want to tell you about one telling in particular, because it's the one that taught me why I do this, and I think it's the right note to end on before the very end. It was years ago now. I was already old, though not as old as I am now. I've been asked to speak at a school on one of the inner coalition worlds. A mixed school, all kinds of children, human and Farron, and a half-dozen other species, all of them young, all of them born long after Tessel 9, to whom the whole thing was just history, a story from before they existed, in the time of their grandparents. I told them the story, the way I've told it to you, The candle-clear terror of the frontier going dark, and Antja's white translucent skin, and the fleet's lights blooming in the dark, and the fortress rising over the gas giant with "We Remember" burning across its face. The Count. The mutiny, Suldane, all of it. And when I was done, a child raised her hand. A small human girl, maybe 8 years old, in the front row. And she asked me a question that I've never forgotten, a question that cut straight to the center of everything. She asked, "Were you scared?" Not "was it exciting?" Not "how big was the fortress really?" Not any of the questions the adults always ask. Just, "Were you scared?" And I told her the truth. I said yes. I said I was scared almost the entire time. I said I was scared when the stations went dark, and scared when Antja translated the transmission, and scared when the fleet arrived, and so scared when the fortress rose over the gas giant that my legs gave out and I fell to my knees. I said I was scared during the whole 60-second count, holding Antja's hand, certain we were all about to die. I said fear was the water I swam in for weeks, and that anyone who tells you they weren't scared during something like that is either lying or wasn't really paying attention. The little girl frowned, thinking hard, and then she asked the second question, the one that mattered even more. "Then why didn't you leave, when the chief said you could go?" And the whole room went quiet because it was a good question, the best question, the question the entire story turns on. Why didn't I leave? A scared kid offered a way out in the path of a fortress. Why did I stay? I thought about it for a long moment. I wanted to give her a true answer, because she'd earned a true answer, the way children who ask the real questions always do. Because being scared and being brave aren't opposites, I told her. That's the thing I most want you to know. People think brave means not scared. It doesn't. Brave means scared and doing the right thing anyway. If I hadn't been scared, staying wouldn't have meant anything. It's only brave to stay if leaving is tempting, and leaving was so tempting and I was so scared. But my friends were there. Antja and Chief Vorsi and 300 people who'd been kind to me. And I decided that whatever happened, I didn't want to be someone who left his friends alone in the dark because he was afraid, even if it killed me, even if it killed all of us. I'd rather have been scared beside the people I loved than safe and alone somewhere, knowing I'd run. I looked at her, at all of them, all those young faces. That's the only kind of brave there is, really, the scared kind. It's the only kind that counts. Anybody can be brave when they're not afraid. The whole point of courage is that it works even when you're terrified, especially when you're terrified. That's what it's for. The little girl nodded slowly, taking it in with that deep seriousness only children can manage. And then she said something that undid me completely, right there in front of the whole school. She said, "I think I would have stayed too." And I had to stop for a minute, because that right there is the whole reason I tell this story. Not to make people marvel at the fortress, not to make humanity look strong, but so that somewhere, someday, a small child hearing it will decide that when her moment comes, and everyone's moment comes, sooner or later, the moment where you can run or stay, pretend or refuse, feed the fear or choose to be someone you'd be proud of, she'll decide in advance, quietly, in a school assembly 40 years after the fact, that she would have stayed too. That's how it passes on. That's how Vorsi's dignity and Suldane's courage and Keen's terrible mercy, and one scared boy's refusal to run all keep living, long after we're gone. Not in monuments. In children, deciding who they're going to be, because someone told them a true story about people who chose well when it was hard. I think I would have stayed too. If this whole telling accomplishes just that, if it plants that one sentence in just one young heart, then it was worth every word. That's the only monument that really lasts. Not the fortress. A child deciding to be brave because she heard how someone else was. I met Admiral Keen once more, years after Tessel 9. She'd retired by then too. The fortress had long since been decommissioned. I'll tell you about that in a moment because it's important, and Keen had stepped down from command and gone home to a quiet world to grow old. But she'd remembered her promise. The one she made over the comm that first night to a scared 19-year-old who'd refused to abandon his friends. When this is over, I'm going to want to shake your hand. She tracked me down, years later, sent word that she'd like to meet if I was willing, and I traveled a long way to a quiet human world to shake the hand of the woman who'd commanded the largest fleet in our history. She was old by then, frail. The terrible calm I'd heard in her voice had softened into something gentler, the way a blade softens when it's finally set down and allowed to rust in peace. We sat on a porch, an actual porch, on an actual house, on an actual planet with weather and birds, and we talked for a long time. I asked her the thing I'd wondered for years, whether she'd ever intended to fire the fortress. Whether, if the coalition fleet hadn't broken, if Captain Dane hadn't stood down, she'd have given the order. She was quiet for a long time. I don't know, she said finally. That's the honest answer, and it's the one I've had to live with. I built that thing so I'd never have to make that choice. I built it so overwhelming that the choice would make itself, so that even the hardliners' own crews would refuse before it came to firing. And it worked. Thank God it worked. But if it hadn't, she looked out at her birds, her weather, her quiet world. I told the galaxy I would fire. And a threat you're not willing to carry out is worse than no threat at all. It gets more people killed in the end, because no one believes you the next time. So I had to be willing. I had to be genuinely willing to kill 100,000 people who were mostly just frightened kids in uniforms, in order to make it so I'd never have to. That's the trap of a weapon like that. To make it work, you have to mean it. And meaning it, her voice caught. Meaning it costs you something. It cost me something. I've never gotten all the way back to who I was before I had to be willing to do that. I didn't know what to say. Don't feel sorry for me, she said, reading my face. I made my choices and I'd make them again. Herrol's reach couldn't go unanswered, not for vengeance, but because a galaxy where you can murder children and face no consequence is a galaxy that murders more children. The debt had to be paid, or the price would have been paid 100 times over by other people's children forever. So I paid it, and I built the fortress so I could pay it without becoming the thing I was punishing. That was the whole trick of it, Oren, the whole terrible trick, to answer a massacre without committing one, to make the numbers balance without the slaughter, to be strong enough that mercy became possible. She smiled tiredly. People think strength is for winning fights. It's not. Strength is for making fights unnecessary. The strongest thing I ever did was build the biggest gun in history and then bend everything about it toward never firing it. Anybody can kill. It takes real strength to be able to kill on a scale beyond imagining, and choose instead to make the other side choose mercy for themselves. Before I left, she took my hand, both of hers around mine, the way she'd taken Vorsi's, all those years ago, and she shook it, finally, the handshake she'd promised a scared boy over a calm line in the middle of a war. You stayed with your people, she said. At 19, with every reason to run, you stayed. Do you have any idea how rare that is? I commanded 100,000 of the bravest people humanity ever produced, and I'm not sure half of them would have made the choice you made at 19 on that station. She squeezed my hand. The fortress isn't the best thing our species did in that whole war, son. You are. A kid who wouldn't leave his friends. That's the thing worth remembering. Everything else was just the machinery around that one true thing. She died a few years later. I went to the service. It was enormous, of course. The whole galaxy mourned Admiral Sarah Keene, the woman who won a war without firing her greatest weapon, who answered a massacre without becoming a murderer, who built the most powerful object in history for the sole purpose of never having to use it. But in all the speeches, in all the honors, I kept thinking about the tired old woman on the porch with her birds, who told a middle-aged man that a scared boy's refusal to run was a better thing than the biggest gun ever built. I think she was right. I've built my whole life around believing she was right. They decommissioned the fortress 10 years after Tessel 9. This surprised people at the time. The most powerful weapon ever built, and humanity just took it apart, voluntarily, while the galaxy was still rebuilding, still uncertain, still full of powers that might have wished us harm. But it made perfect sense if you understood what the fortress had always been for. It was never a weapon, not really. It was a sentence. We remember. And once that sentence had been spoken, once the whole galaxy had seen it, understood it, felt it in their bones, the physical object had done its job. Keeping it around would have turned it into something else. A threat. A standing menace. The very thing the hardliners had accused humanity of being. And that would have betrayed everything the fortress actually stood for. So they took it apart. And here's the part I love, the part that tells you everything. They didn't scrap it. They didn't melt it down for raw materials or mothball it in some deep space graveyard. They turned it into a memorial. A real one, a permanent one, in orbit around Herrol's Reach itself, the colony where it all began. They took the great forward structure of the fortress, the command prow, the miles-high cliff of metal with "We Remember" written across it in letters taller than mountains, and they left it there, in orbit around the world of the murdered children, turning slowly forever, so that anyone who ever comes to Herrol's Reach, human, coalition, any species at all, has to see it, has to read it, has to remember. The rest of the fortress became other things: ships, stations, tools. The wealth of whole worlds that Petra Coyle told me about went back into the galaxy that had bled to create it. But the prow stays. The two words stay. We remember, turning over Herrol's Reach forever. I went there once, to Herrol's Reach, late in my life when I finally felt strong enough. I'd spent decades telling this story, but I'd never been to the place where it started, and I felt at last that I needed to. That I owed the children that much to come and see and remember in person. It's a peaceful world now. They rebuilt it. New colonists came, years after, and made farms again under that new sun, and there are families there now, and children playing in fields where the worst thing in galactic history once happened. That's the way of it. Life comes back. It always comes back. That's not a betrayal of the dead. It's the whole reason they're worth mourning. Because life is precious enough that its loss is a catastrophe and its return is a miracle. And above the farms, above the children, above the fields, the prow turns. We remember, huge in the sky, catching the light of the new sun. The children of Herrol's Reach grow up under those words. They ask their parents what they mean. And their parents tell them the story, the colony, the massacre, the Vanguard, the fortress, the trial. The long, hard building of a better galaxy out of the ashes of the worst thing anyone ever did. They tell them so the children will remember. So that we all keep remembering. Forever. I've told this story 1,000 times. In schools, in halls, to coalition audiences and human audiences and mixed crowds of a dozen species. And I've noticed something over all those tellings. The part people remember isn't the part I expect. They come for the fortress. Every time. The title of the thing, whatever version of it gets them in the door, always promises the fortress, the colossal war fortress, the biggest thing humanity ever built, hanging in an alien sky. That's what pulls them in. The spectacle, the power, the image of we remember wheeling across the stars. But that's not the part they leave with. I've watched their faces for 40 years, and I know. The part they leave with is smaller. It's Chief Vorsey telling 300 frightened people to be someone they'd be proud to have been. It's Captain Suldane deciding he'd rather be ashamed and alive and decent than proud and dead and complicit. It's Petra Coyle, the gunner who spent a war praying she'd never fire her gun. It's Admiral Keene on a porch with her birds, saying a scared boy who wouldn't run was a better thing than the biggest gun in history. It's an old alien woman getting her hope back because a 19-year-old wouldn't leave his family behind. That's what they leave with, the people. The small human choices and the small Farron choices and the small choices of every species in this story, the tiny moments where someone, faced with fear, chose to be decent instead. Those are the moments that survive the telling. The fortress is just the thing that got everyone to sit down and listen. And I think that's exactly right. I think that's the whole secret of it, the thing Ancha understood and wrote a famous book about, and I've spent 40 years slowly coming to understand myself. The fortress wasn't the point. The fortress was never the point. The fortress was just how humanity got the galaxy's attention. It was the biggest, loudest, most impossible way of saying, look what you did, look what it cost, look what we're capable of when you do the thing you must never do. It was the Vanguard's Vanguard, the exclamation point at the end of a sentence written in grief. But the sentence itself, the actual message, the thing all that impossible power was in service of, the sentence was simple. It was small enough to fit in 2 words, and those 2 words weren't about strength at all. We remember. We remember the children. We remember the colony. We remember the ones who tried to warn us and the ones who wouldn't listen. We remember the captain who stood down and the gunner who never fired and the old chief who kept her people's dignity intact through the arrival of a moon. We remember the scared kids in uniforms on both sides who just wanted to go home. We remember the whole terrible, beautiful thing, all of it, and we build monuments the size of worlds to make sure the memory never dies, because a people who forgets is a people who lets it happen again. That's what we are. That's the truth the galaxy learned at Tessel 9 and never forgot, and I hope never forgets. Not that we're strong, everyone can be strong. That we remember. That underneath all our patience and all our kindness and all our treaties, there is a thing that does not forget and does not let go, and will cross a frontier and build a moon and bend all the power in the universe toward a single quiet purpose, making sure that what happened to those children can never, ever happen again. The human navy was just the vanguard. The colossal war fortress came next. But behind the fortress, behind all of it, driving all of it, the real force the whole galaxy mistook for softness until it was far too late. Behind the fortress there was only ever this. A people who remember, and who love their children enough to make the whole universe remember with them. I was there. I saw it. I've told you the truth of it, the way it actually happened, from the eyes of the one human on a nothing rock who stayed when he could have run. And now you've heard it, which means now you remember too. So carry it, pass it on, tell it to someone who wasn't there. Because that's the whole point. That's the only monument that really lasts. Not the fortress. Not the prow turning over Herrol's reach. You remembering and telling it again. That's how the light stays on. That's how the children stay unforgotten. That's how a debt paid once in grief 40 years ago keeps on being worth what it cost. We remember. Now so do you. That's the whole story. That's everything.